ethics involved. In the pharmaceutical industry, data integrity wasn't just about efficiency or accuracy. It could literally be a matter of life and death. When Brian hired Heather 6 months ago, I'd actually welcomed the help. The system had grown increasingly complex as our client base expanded, and having someone manage the day-to-day operations would free me up to implement the improvements I'd been planning for months. I'd spent countless hours training her, carefully walking her through the standard procedures, showing her how to handle routine updates and respond to common issues. She was bright and eager, quick to pick up the operational side of things. Though there hadn't been time to cover the underlying architecture in depth, the invisible connective tissue that made everything work seamlessly, I'd planned to get to that eventually. After all, I thought we'd be working together for years to come. "I need your key card and passwords before you leave today," Brian continued, sliding a severance agreement across the desk toward me. 2 weeks' pay, standard confidentiality clauses, nothing unusual. I scanned the document, the words blurring slightly as my eyes struggled to focus. "Today is my birthday," I said, the statement sounding hollow even to me, like I was reading a line from someone else's script. Brian had the decency to look uncomfortable for a moment, his confident facade cracking just slightly. "Sorry about the timing." HR picked the date. He recovered quickly, his professional mask sliding back into place. I signed the agreement mechanically, my hand moving as if controlled by someone else, then stood up on legs that felt unsteady. "Heather will need the emergency protocols for when systems don't synchronize properly," I said, falling back on the practical because it was all I had left to hold on to. "They're not in the documentation. The situations are too varied, too context dependent to capture in a manual." "I'm sure she'll figure it out," Brian replied, already checking his phone, his attention moving past me to whatever came next in his day. "She's quite resourceful." As I packed my desk, carefully placing my few personal items into a cardboard box that someone had thoughtfully provided, Heather approached. Her expression was a mixture of sympathy and awkwardness, and I could see genuine distress in her eyes. "I'm really sorry," she whispered, glancing nervously toward Brian's office. "I had no idea this was happening. I swear, Aurora, I didn't know." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and handed her my system notebook, the one I'd filled with notes and observations over 3 years. A notification popped up on my computer screen just as I was logging out for the last time. "Database sync error on client trial directs 1429. Manual resolution required." I started to explain the error, my professional instincts kicking in automatically, but Brian appeared at my elbow, ushering me toward the exit. "Heather's got this," he said firmly. "It's time for you to go." I smiled tightly, gathering my box and my purse. "Good luck," I said to Heather, meaning it more sincerely than either of them could possibly understand. My path to MediSync had begun after 15 years in database architecture. I'd built systems for insurance companies, retail chains, and finally the pharmaceutical industry, where the stakes were highest and the margin for error smallest. Clinical trial information had to be seamlessly integrated across research platforms, regulatory submission systems, and client dashboards with zero tolerance for mistakes. A single data error could invalidate years of research, or worse, endanger patient safety. When MediSync recruited me 3 years ago, they were struggling with an outdated system that frequently crashed, losing data and frustrating clients. Within 6 months, I'd redesigned their entire architecture, creating a robust integration framework that accommodated their complex needs while maintaining regulatory compliance. Client satisfaction scores rose dramatically, and the company landed 3 major pharmaceutical contracts based largely on the strength of their innovative data management solutions. Solutions I had built from the ground up, working late nights and weekends to get every detail right. Brian Morgan became my manager a year ago when the previous director retired. He had a background in sales rather than technology, which initially concerned me, but I tried to be open-minded. Different perspectives could be valuable, I told myself. He spoke constantly about streamlining why we simplified. These verification steps seem excessive, he'd comment during review meetings, tapping his pen impatiently against his notepad. Couldn't we eliminate some of these redundancies? It's adding time to every process cycle. I'd patiently explain that what looked like redundancy was actually essential error-catching architecture. The system's strength lay in its multiple verification points that prevented a corruption from cascading through interconnected databases. Each check served a specific purpose, catching different types of errors at different stages of data processing. Brian would nod, but I could tell he wasn't fully grasping the technical nuances. His eyes would glaze over slightly when I got in, and he'd often saving. I've spent my gained experience, and I knowledge was eager and quick to learn the operational procedures, though she sometimes grew impatient with details. Do we really need to run all these verification queries? She'd ask, watching the progress bars crawl across her screen. It adds an hour to the process. That hour prevents weeks of potential disaster recovery. I'd explain, pulling up examples of past incidents at other companies where shortcuts had led to catastrophic failures. The system is more fragile than it appears on the surface. Everything is interconnected in ways that aren't immediately obvious. In recent weeks, I'd noticed Brian and Heather in frequent private meetings. I assumed they were discussing her professional development, perhaps planning to expand her responsibilities within the team. I even prepared additional training materials, anticipating that she might take over some of my routine tasks, freeing me up for the strategic work I enjoyed most. What I didn't anticipate was becoming completely expendable. In retrospect, the signs were there. Brian's increasing questions about whether my processes could be streamlined, his sudden interest in detailed documentation of everything I did, the gradual exclusion from strategic meetings where decisions about the department's future were being made. But I'd been too focused on improving the system and training my replacement to see what was actually happening. I'd been building my own obsolescence, one carefully documented procedure at a time. The morning after my unceremonious termination, I woke to a string of LinkedIn notifications. News of my departure had apparently spread quickly through professional circles. 3 former colleagues had sent messages expressing shock and asking for new opportunities. The pharmaceutical data integration field was specialized enough that experienced architects like me were always in demand. Companies were constantly struggling to find people who understood both the technical complexity and the regulatory requirements. I spent the day updating my resume and researching positions, trying to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the humiliation of being escorted from the building on my birthday with my belongings in a cardboard box. By evening, I'd lined up 2 promising interviews for later in the week. My phone rang just after dinner. It was Jacob, a developer from my former team at MediSync, someone I'd worked closely with on several major implementations. Aurora, I know you probably don't want to talk about work, but I'm stuck on something, he said, his voice tight with stress. The Durex 1429 trial database is showing inconsistencies after the routine Sunday update. I've tried everything in your documentation, but nothing's working. The data just won't reconcile. I remembered the error notification I'd seen just before leaving on Friday. Did you run the verification sequence on the secondary tables? I asked, my mind automatically shifting into troubleshooting mode. Yes, but the systems aren't reconciling, Jacob replied. Heather said to just force an override, that it would clear the error flags and we could move on. I winced. Definitely don't do that. It could corrupt the entire trial data set. The override bypasses the integrity checks, and if there's an actual synchronization problem, you'll just be papering over it while the underlying issue gets worse. That's what I thought, Jacob sighed with relief. I told Brian we should call you, but he said we needed to handle it internally, that we couldn't be dependent on you anymore. After providing some guidance, careful not to violate the confidentiality agreement I'd signed, I hung up feeling a curious mix of vindication and concern. The system I'd built was intricate, with carefully designed fail safes and interconnection points that weren't immediately obvious to someone who only understood the surface operations. Without understanding the underlying architecture, attempting fixes could make problems exponentially worse. 2 more calls came in that evening from different team members, each describing escalating problems. Apparently, Heather had indeed attempted to force an override, which had triggered cascading errors across multiple client databases. The team was now in emergency reflector, which now hadn't one of the hiring manager impressed with my portfolio and track record, asked why I'd left my previous position. Restructuring, I said simply. They decided routing made about effect and my pulse quickened. I wouldn't know. I'm no longer with the company. By Wednesday, I had received official offers completely that met my architecture skills from colleagues in the industry. Meanwhile, my phone continued to accumulate missed calls from Brian. They turn the several include required term and professional admin their systems. The call frequent and urgent traveling at my former work. My curiosity, I accept on the first. Aurora, we have a situation with her neutrally examining my fingernails. Look, I'll be direct. The system is in complete meltdown. After that initial error on Monday, dashboards and correct trial rectory supplies, we have hints threatening contracting the casters, what I designed the protocols to prevent. That's unfortunate, Brian. I signed a severance agreement. I'm no longer an employee. I paused, letting that sink in, and I have several other professional opportunities I'm currently evaluating. I understand that, he said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. We'd bring you back as a consultant. Name your rate, we just need you to fix this before we lose everything. The offer was tempting, not for the money, but for the satisfaction of being proven right. However, I knew better than to rush into anything. I'd need full system access and complete autonomy to implement solutions, I said carefully. No interference, no second. Guessing, no questioning my methods. Absolutely, Brian agreed immediately. Whatever you need. You're the expert. I'll think about it and get back to you this afternoon. After hanging up, I called Jacob for an unofficial assessment firm had in the problem underconnect and created new different parts of the Jacob. Pharmadyne is threatening to pull their contract. That's 30% of the company's And there's talk about potential affect the liability or weighing the satisfaction in Brian's desperation. By noon, I'd made my decision and called him back. "I'll help," I said. "My consulting rate is $300 an hour with a minimum engagement of 40 hours payable upfront." Brian didn't even hesitate. "Done. When can you start?" Sync felt surreal. Colleagues greeted me with obvious relief, some looking almost tearful at my return. Nervously absent and a score she called my she's claw things. System credential-guided assessment. Extensive logical who solutions use. Tried to fit hammer. Soon, I had stayed most critical systems and developed a recovery plan for the rest. The work was methodical and precise, years of experience guiding my decisions. Brian checked in frequently. Each time more relieved as progress, he said by gratitude. "I were thank you without as I was for the day with I've been offered you your job back," he said, pushing the documents toward me. With a 15% raise and a more senior title, Senior Director of Database Architecture, I glanced at the offer letter without touching it. "I'll consider it after we resolve the current crisis." "Of course," he nodded eagerly. "Take your time. We just want you to know how valued you are." But as I gathered my things, I noticed an email on Brian's open laptop on the desk beside me. It was from the CEO, Victoria Winters, with the subject line "Transition Plan once system is stabilized." The visible preview text read, "Get everything documented properly this time before we make any changes." I felt a chill. They weren't offering my job back out of recognition of my value. They simply needed me to repair the system and document everything so thoroughly that even Heather could maintain it. Then they'd discard me again, probably with someone even cheaper. The decision I thought I had was just another illusion, another manipulation. The next morning, I arrived early to continue my recovery work. The system was responding well to my corrections, and I estimated another 2 or 3 days before everything would be fully functional again. I worked methodically, carefully documenting each step, not for Brian's future transition plan, but for my own records, evidence if I needed it. Around midday, the CEO of my work will tell you help us through her perfectly styled hair and expensive suit, projecting confidence and control. "Brian speaks very highly of your..." I nodded. "Wonderful." Brian potential return to a permanent position. He mentioned it. I replied, keeping my focus on the screen. Victoria's smile tightened. Once this saw, perhaps I'd fresh air from her, and we agreed to the street by dark circuits let down. "Tell me what?" Heather glanced around before leaning forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. The system failure wasn't an accident, at least not entirely. I felt my body go still. "Explain." "Brian asked me to implement some optimizations to the system make things more efficient. Concept to thing when any such changes, I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. I realized that later, Heather admitted, trembling coffee cup. Things start Monday. Brian, you and me. He read over coach at ourselves to persist. She pulled and showed from his instructed her without expressed in problems. The evidence was damning. By the time he finally decided to call you, I was having panic attacks. I couldn't sleep knowing what we'd done to the system, what I'd done by trusting him. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Heather's eyes filled with tears because they're planning to blame me for everything. Yesterday, HR called me in and said they're conducting an investigation into procedural violations that led to the system failure. Brian told them I made unauthorized changes against his instructions. He's making me the scapegoat for his failed experiment. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Brian had deliberately undermined the system architecture I'd built, likely to prove that his streamlined approach was superior. When everything collapsed, he needed me to fix it, but afterward, Heather would take the fall and he would emerge as the manager who handled the crisis effectively. It was calculated and ruthless. I have a job offer. Connect you. Going to accept it before all this happened. Now Brian's threatening to give me a negative reference. Sure, blacklist felt a surge of anger from younger and stimulated in this. My medication system every thing I had toxic action that might help Heather and perhaps other employees while exposing Brian's sabotage. The choice was obvious. Back at MediSync, I continued the recovery work with renewed purpose. While my hands fixed the technical issues, my mind developed a different kind of solution. What I needed was irrefutable evidence of Brian's deliberate actions, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or technical confusion. I recalled something Jacob had mentioned months ago. All system changes were automatically logged on a secure server for regulatory compliance purposes. Those logs would show exactly who had authorized the optimizations and when they were implemented. They couldn't be altered without leaving traces. During a moment when the office was mostly empty, I accessed the compliance server using my admin credentials and found exactly what I was looking for. The logs clearly showed Brian had used his administrative override to approve significant changes to the verification protocols, changes that directly contradicted the system architecture documentation. Most damning of all, he had backdated the approval to make it appear these changes had been pending for weeks, implying my tacit acceptance of the modifications. I downloaded the logs to a secure drive and then sent myself an encrypted email with the files attached for good measure. I took screenshots showing the timestamps of the original changes versus the backdated approvals. The evidence was comprehensive and irrefutable. Now I needed to understand who else was involved. Had Victoria known about Brian's plan to sabotage the system, or was she merely complicit in using the crisis as an opportunity to rehire me temporarily? The answer came unexpectedly when Brian's calendar notification popped up on his laptop during our afternoon status meeting. Discuss AC transition plan with VW4, 30 p.m. AC was clearly me, Aurora Chen. VW was Victoria Winters. I need a bit more time on the regulatory module, I told Brian. Probably another hour. You go ahead to your meeting. Once he left, I quickly finished my work on the system, then set up one final safety measure, a hidden diagnostic tool that would alert me to any unauthorized changes to the core architecture. sending notifications directly to my personal email. It wasn't technically part of my consulting agreement, but I justified it as professional due diligence. If they tried to sabotage the system again, I'd know immediately. At 5:15, I packed up my things and prepared to leave for the weekend. The system was now 80% recovered, with only minor issues remaining that I could resolve remotely. As I passed the conference room on my way out, I heard Brian's voice rising in frustration. "But she's fixing everything. Can't we at least wait until Monday before making any decisions?" Victoria's response was cool and clear, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to making difficult business decisions. "The decision is made. Once she submits the final documentation, we thank her for her consulting work and proceed with the transition to the simplified architecture. Heather was just a trial run. We've already identified another junior developer who can maintain the streamlined system at an even lower salary point. And if it fails again," Brian's voice held doubt, "it won't, because Aurora will have documented every aspect of the recovery process. That's the whole point of bringing her back as a consultant. We get her expertise, her documentation, and then we move on with someone more cost-effective. It's just business, Brian. I'd heard enough." I slipped away before they could exit the conference room, a strange calm settling over me. I now had all the evidence I needed and a weekend to decide exactly how to use it. The anger had transformed into something colder and more focused. Determination. Sunday evening, I received a text from Brian. "System looking stable. Just need final documentation tomorrow to close out your consulting engagement. CEO wants to meet at 9 a.m. I responded simply, "I'll be there." What Brian didn't know was that I'd spent the weekend consulting with both a labor attorney and a regulatory compliance expert at the FDA, who had expressed significant concern about the deliberate manipulation of pharmaceutical trial data systems. When I explained the situation, the FDA representative had been very interested in seeing my evidence. Deliberately compromising systems that managed clinical trial data wasn't just unethical. It was potentially criminal, especially if it had endangered patient safety or corrupted research results. I had also accepted the position at Pharma, connect with a specific condition they had happily accommodated. They agreed to bring both Jacob and Heather onto my team if they wanted to leave MediSync. The company was eager enough to hire me that they'd agreed to the package deal. Monday morning would bring answers to questions Brian and Victoria didn't even know to ask. And I would be ready. I arrived at MediSync at exactly 9 o'clock Monday morning, carrying a slim portfolio containing my consulting invoice and several other carefully prepared documents. Victoria's executive assistant showed me into the conference room, where Victoria, Brian, and two people I didn't recognize were already seated. A woman in a severe suit and a nervous-looking man with a legal pad. "Aurora, thank you for coming," Victoria began with practiced warmth. "This is Patricia from HR and Jonathan from Legal. They're here to formalize the conclusion of your consulting engagement and discuss the permanent position we'd like to offer you." I smiled pleasantly, setting my portfolio on the table. How convenient. I've brought some documentation that requires legal review as well. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened again. Jacob entered, followed by Heather and two men in dark suits who definitely weren't MediSync employees. The air in the room changed instantly, tension crackling like electricity. "What is the meaning of this?" Victoria demanded, half rising from her chair. "I invited a few additional participants," I said calmly, my voice steady. "Jacob and Heather have first-hand knowledge relevant to our discussion, and these gentlemen are from the FDA Office of Regulatory Compliance. They're very interested in the events of the past week." The color drained from Brian's face. "The FDA, this is an internal company matter." "You can't just actually," one of the agents interrupted. His voice professional and cool, deliberate tampering with systems that manage pharmaceutical trial data falls squarely within our jurisdiction. Miss Chen contacted our office with evidence suggesting serious compliance violations that could have endangered patient safety and research integrity. I opened my portfolio and distributed copies of a comprehensive report I'd prepared over the weekend. It detailed the system architecture, the unauthorized changes Brian had ordered, the attempted cover-up, the backdated approvals, and the impact on client data integrity. The final page contained my sworn statement and signature, notarized by my attorney. "This constitutes my final documentation as requested," I said, sliding the original across to Victoria. "I've also accepted a position with Pharma Connect starting tomorrow. My first assignment is implementing a rescue plan for all MediSync clients who wish to transfer their data to a more stable platform." Victoria's composure finally cracked, her professional mask slipping. "You can't do this. Those clients are under contract, contracts with specific performance guarantees regarding data integrity." I corrected her. "Guarantees you've breached. My attorney has already reviewed the relevant clauses. Your clients have grounds to terminate without penalty." The FDA agents began asking pointed questions about change management protocols, verification procedures, and who had authorized the modifications to the system. As the interrogation continued, Brian's face grew increasingly pale, and Victoria's responses became more careful and measured, her earlier confidence evaporating. I quietly excused myself after about an hour, nodding to Jake. I left. They followed me out shortly after, and we walked together to the coffee shop across the street. "Thank you," Heather said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared about what they were going to do to me." "You deserved better than to be used as a scapegoat," I replied. "We all do. That's why I couldn't just walk away." 6 months later, I sat in my new corner office at Pharma Connect, reviewing the quarterly performance report. The transition of former MediSync clients had gone remarkably smoothly, thanks in part to Jacob and Heather, who had both enthusiastically joined me at the new company. They brought not only their technical skills, but also detailed knowledge of MediSync's client relationships and system quirks that proved invaluable during the migration. The industry newsletter on my desk contained a small item noting that MediSync had been acquired by a larger competitor after experiencing significant client attrition and regulatory challenges. The acquisition had happened at a fraction of the company's previous valuation. Brian and Victoria